Welcome my friends to this video. This one has been a long time coming. My name is Michelangelo if you're new to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the real Christ. We're going to go into the actual secret teachings about who Jesus Christ actually is, what his mission actually was, and how this knowledge was hidden from humanity in order to create a hierarchical system where we can be controlled. And so before we get into this, just as a caveat, I am filming this in wonderful, beautiful Luxor, Egypt, and I'm in a small actual local village. I'm not in a hotel or anything like that. So my neighbors are farmers, they're doing construction. You might hear some things, you might hear some people talking. I just invite you to let that be the ambiance, because we're in one of the areas where the personage, the historical person, Jesus, actually trained and was initiated into the Egyptian mysteries. And so with that being said, that is a great segue into kind of this introduction on the real Christ. And so the first discernment here is realizing that there's an actual difference between the historical person Jesus and what we will call the Christ impulse or the Christ being. And so let's get into that. We're going to get into what Christ actually is so that you can clearly see how there's a difference between Christ and the person, the vessel that was Jesus. Because this distinction sets up the entire context for really grokking this, for really getting this, okay? So we're going to be talking about two different passages in the Bible. One of them is from the Old Testament, which is Genesis, which is the story of creation and the Garden of Eden story. And the other piece I'm going to bring in here is the most mystical gospel of the four canonical gospels, which are a part of the Bible, is the Gospel of St. John. These two passages or parables in the Bible kind of set us up with the backdrop to really understand the real Christ. So let us begin with Genesis, with the Garden of Eden. Now, the Garden of Eden is where Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge that the serpent, who is Lucifer, convinced them to eat, and then they fell. It describes the fall of humanity. So what humanity was falling from was a state of unity, a state where we were not in the material physical world. We were in the spiritual world still, and we were in more of like a dreamlike state of consciousness where we were actually unified with God. We were unified with the Godhead. There was no death. There was no decay. Animals didn't fight each other. There was no sort of gore and flesh and all of that we know the physical dimension to be today. It was a state of perfection. It was a state of perfection and a state of immortality. And according to the Esoteric doctrine, it was a time where Earth was completely spiritualized, like I'm saying. It was not crystallized into the material dimension. And so it's describing a different state of consciousness, a different state of being than we have today. That's why you'll never find the Garden of Eden on Earth, because it wasn't a physical place. According to the esoteric side of Christianity, the internal hidden teachings of Christianity, it was describing a time where the earth was merged with the sun in a spiritual sense, that the earth and the sun were one. Now, why that is because every planet in our solar system, the sun and earth and the moon also included, has a spiritual being, a spiritual entity that is the soul, so to speak, of that planet. And this is why in ancient alchemy or astrology, certain planets have certain signs, they have certain flavors, right? Certain archetypal energies that they hold. And what that's pointing to on a spiritual plane, it's pointing to the actual being, or we could say the principle that governs that planet, because they're not like entities like a person like you and me so much, but they're more principles, just like the law of gravity is a principle, it's a cosmic principle. The sun has a certain spiritual principle, and we could call that an impulse. And so you heard me before say the Christ impulse. The principle of the sun is Christ. Now, why is that? It's actually called, the Greeks called it logos. And now we're going to bring in the Gospel of St. John. The first words in his Gospel, the English translation, the modern translation says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. But this is one of the ways that the true teaching was hidden, because they changed the actual translation. And this is not just semantics, this is not just wordplay. If you change certain words in certain translations, it changes the entire meaning and context of the passage. What John actually wrote, because he actually wrote that gospel while he lived on a Greek island, and so he wrote it, I believe he actually wrote it in Greek. And the word he used was, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God. He was actually describing that Eden state, the Edenic state, where the Logos was still unified with the Godhead. It was still in the womb of God. And also describing how earth was completely spiritualized, and we were included in that unity. Everything was a complete unity. So stay with me here. Now, the Greeks came up with this term. It was Heraclitus who came up with the term logos. And logos, he was describing, in the Orient, they would call it the Tao, the great Tao. It's like Taoism. It is the actual manifest aspect of God, the aspect of God, of the all, that is manifest in everything. So it is the all in all, right? How everything in this universe actually holds a little piece of God in it. And in Kabbalah, this is actually the story of creation, how we fell and that unity was shattered. And so everything in the physical material realm holds a little glass shard, they say, a little spark of the divine. And that spark of the divine is the Logos. It is the all-pervading divine mind that permeates the physical reality. And so that Logos is the part of us that we're able to touch, that's connected to God. It is the eye behind the eye, so to speak. So essentially, without giving you too many different pieces, why I'm going here is because we're describing how we actually fell from a unitive state. And in ancient mystery schools and ancient processes of initiation, you would go through a certain process that would give you a certain level of clairvoyance, where you would actually experience these planetary deities, so to speak, and you'd be able to actually experience the Logos, for example. But it wasn't in a complete state yet. It wasn't in a complete state yet because our connection to the spiritual worlds was actually degrading. And this is, we're gonna bookmark that and come back, because that will bring us to why Christ was actually needed to incarnate. But essentially, when the Word was with God, right, what that is essentially describing is when everything was in complete unity, including the spiritual earth, which is the Eden state. Okay, it's the Eden state that we were describing before. So everything was in complete unity, right? And we could say then, in a symbolic sense, that the spiritual sun, which is the Logos, which is the manifested form of God for our dimension, for our solar system, that was unified with Earth, so we were one with it, okay? And this is very different, so it might be hard to wrap your head around this stuff, because this is like, we can only point to this stuff with symbol and metaphor, because it's beyond the physical dimension. But what happened was, through the fall, by eating of the tree of knowledge, what happened was humanity began to develop self-awareness. And we know that because when Eve ate of the fruit and Adam ate of the fruit, the first thing they said was, and they saw that they were naked and they were ashamed. So what that was showing you is, before they didn't know they were naked because they had no self-awareness. And then they ate of the tree of knowledge, and they were now aware that they were an individual being. So what the Garden of Eden is describing is the beginning of the development of the ego in the human being. Eventually, we were meant to develop that capacity. But the serpent, which is representative of Lucifer, who is distinct from Satan. It's going to be another video. I know, guys, this is a lot. But the serpent, Lucifer, coerced Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit. So what that was showing us was that there was a force that gave humanity the ego before we were actually ready to receive that. And so we got it too early, and so that had certain consequences. And so there were certain adversarial forces that were infused into our consciousness that still affect us today. And so what happened was we started to fall into materialism. And so through that, the logos, the spiritual sun and the spiritual earth, were separated, and everything started to fall into the physical dimension, where you have the sun over here, all the planets, earth, everything was individualized. And slowly, we were now like amphibious beings, where we were starting to crystallize into the material dimensions, into the material plane, and we were starting to lose contact or perception of the spiritual worlds. But this happened slowly. And the first epoch of this kind of era was the Indian epoch. So we had India, Persia, Egypt, Chaldea, Babylon, this whole era. There were certain schools that were set up, certain mystery schools that were set up, that were designed to keep this spiritual knowledge alive as we fell deeper and deeper into materialism. Now keep in mind, throughout this whole thing, the human being did not have the same consciousness that we have today. So the seeds of the ego, of the I consciousness, I am Michael in this body that's separate from you and separate from everything else, that wasn't fully formed yet. It was just a little baby. It was a seedling. It was a little sapling in consciousness. And we experienced ourselves we had a much more transpersonal sense of experience. Again, we were kind of in this dreamlike state. Think of like the Greco-Roman era and all of the great Greek myths. Every decision that the human being made was based upon whether the god Apollo or the goddess Athena told them to do certain things, or a different god or goddess came to them in a dream, or in Egypt, same thing. What it was showing us was that the human being experienced the spiritual worlds just like we experience the physical world, external to us, outside of us, and we actually literally experienced these beings. So all of these myths are not just metaphor. They're describing literal experiences that people had of spiritual worlds and of spiritual entities. And so while we were falling into materialism, our species was constantly bombarded and influenced by these spiritual beings who told us what to do. We didn't have free will, was not fully developed yet. It was not fully developed yet. But slowly over time, we lost that sense of clairvoyance more and more and more, until we get to the point right before Christ incarnated, which, as we know now, Christ is the Logos. And that's why there had to be an incarnation, because Christ, the Son being, the Son God, the Logos, which is the principle that governs the Son, which is also the manifest form of God, of the Godhead in the physical world. And that's why so many cultures worshipped the sun on our planet. That's why, okay? But there had to be that incarnation, because now there was this increasing separation between the physical worlds and the spiritual worlds. But with this being said, even though there were some other forces at play here, it was part of the greater cosmic plan for humanity to descend in the material world. It's not like we did something wrong and fell, so to speak. It actually was meant to happen so that we could actually fully crystallize into our bony little skulls and fully develop an individualized sense of free will, so we weren't just automatons of spirit influenced by this god and that god and all the things. So we could have a fully discerning, self-sourcing, free will consciousness. The ego. And so the ego isn't bad, guys, which many spiritual teachings think it is. It's just been a place that has been, again, hijacked, because, for example, we have the Luciferic influence that is intertwined with the ego consciousness, which is described in the Garden of Eden. And there's also another force at play here, which is the being called Ahriman. And Ahriman is from the Persian tradition, the Zoroastrian tradition. He's like the antagonist in that spiritual lineage. And he is the spirit of materialism, of the physical world, the spirit of materialism. In Christianity, he would be akin to Satan, okay? And so again, Lucifer and Satan are different beings. But Ahriman is a more accurate term for this being, because it's just a complete, to give you an idea, he's like the manifestation of technology, right? Artificial intelligence. It's a completely material consciousness that's completely severed from the spiritual worlds. And so we also had this being coming up from below, pulling us into material realms, Ahriman. And as we crystallized into our skull, into our egos, we actually lost the ability to cognize the spiritual world externally. That's why we don't have it today. That's why we look at the Greek myths as just myths, because, we don't understand that consciousness changed and evolved, and we actually lost that ability. And part of the reason why we lost that ability is due to the spirit of materialism. This kind of brings us to that Greco-Roman period where Christ actually incarnated through the physical body of Jesus, who was an initiate. And that's the difference there. Now we can see there's a clear difference between Jesus, the historical person, and Christ, the Logos, the spiritual impulse. When we come upon the Greco-Roman period, basically what happened was the human species was at risk of being completely severed from the higher spiritual worlds. Completely severed. We almost completely lost that connection. And we were becoming so intellectualized, so overly crystallized in our ego, that eventually it would have completely cut us off from each other and from the spiritual worlds, and we would have been completely imprisoned in the material realms. Our souls would be completely imprisoned here with no contact to the spiritual dimension. And that's why there needed to be an incarnation of the Christ impulse, of the Christ being, of the Logos, to re-establish that connection. And that's why there is a sense of our species being saved, of a supernatural support, a supernatural being coming down to help humanity reestablish this connection. But that doesn't mean that there's not work for us to be done, which we'll get into. And so there was a dire need for the Logos, the Word, the Spirit of the Son, the Christ, to incarnate into the physical dimension, and his mission was to plant the seeds into humanity's ego consciousness of the interior experience of the spiritual worlds, since they could no longer be experienced externally like in the older epochs. So we had to go internally. That is why Christ consciousness is associated with I am, because it was the birthing. His mission was to actually birth the full sense of interiority within ourselves, within the ego, which through that gate, through that narrow gate, is actually the doorway, the entryway into experiencing the higher angelic realms. So, since that connection was severed externally, there's like a little Trojan horse move, where now he planted that connection, the seed of that connection internally. And so now, that completely changed the trajectory. That completely changed the trajectory of the human race. That's why the incarnation of the Christ is the most important spiritual fact that has ever happened on earth. Without it, again, we would have eventually degraded into just more and more separation and would have been completely materialized and locked in that, without that. And so that's why this isn't just another spiritual teacher or anything like that. This is a mystical fact that completely changed the destiny of Earth and the destiny of the human species. Now that that seed is planted, the kingdom of God can now blossom. And now the idea is that slowly Earth and the material realms and us are becoming more and more and more spiritualized. And eventually we're ascending back into that state of unity with the spiritual worlds where we initially fell from. And so notice we have an arc. We have a descending arc of evolution, and we have an ascending arc of evolution. And the turning point, the great hinge upon which our evolution turned, was the incarnation of Christ. Another piece I want to bring in here for you guys, just to lock this in, of this was an astronomical, but also astrological cosmic event that the entire lineage of spiritual teachers and spiritual schools and all the things before that moment were preparing the way for this to happen. And that's why the actual historical person of Jesus is kind of like this patchwork of all these different deities from around the world. You know, like Krishna, he was born on December 25th. Or like Mithras from the Roman mysteries was heralded by a star in the sky, his birth. Or Horus walked on water, or Osiris was resurrected from the dead. He's sort of like this hodgepodge of all these things that happen to other spiritual teachers and beings throughout the ages, and most people would look at that and use that as a reason to say, oh, well, look, he was made up, it was a fantasy. But in the esoteric sense, in the occult sense, it's actually a sign, a significance that it's showing us that the whole cosmos strained to give birth to this being that could actually hold the Christ spirit. The whole cosmos was supporting this and happening. And these were all of these omens and signs coincided for this event to take place because it was that big, it was that monumental, and the entire spiritual cosmos depended upon it. And it also shows symbolically how Jesus Christ, that his ministry, his purpose, the other part of his mission, the more mission of while he was here, what he was doing was tying together all the different threads from all the different mystery traditions. Because the mystery traditions, again, were guarded and kept secret, and they were not given to people. They were hidden away, and they're still hidden away today. It's way more cloak and dagger. Why do you think all of the other gospels were thrown away? Why do you think they were hidden? Why do you think there's such a focus on the suffering Jesus, the historical person of Jesus? It's to keep us away from actually seeing this stuff. These forces, these adversarial forces, are at play more than ever, guys. And I'm not saying it's to fearmonger, but if we don't know what we're working with, how can we navigate it? How can we empower ourselves? And so part of the reason why Jesus Christ was crucified was not because he said he was one with God. That was maybe a part of it, but the real reason, the actual reason, which you won't find in the Bible or any of the pieces, is because he was actually bringing forth the initiatory secret knowledge that was guarded by state-sanctioned mystery schools, by elites. You can see that, for example, through the raising of Lazarus. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, Lazarus came to him in the middle of the night. He learned the initiatory knowledge, the inner teachings, because Jesus said, to the masses, I speak in parables, but to my inner circle, I speak direct truth. And so he did share the inner teachings of this secret knowledge directly to people. And Lazarus was one of those people, and his death rebirth actually symbolized what would happen in mystery schools, where, for example, in ancient Egypt, in the king's chamber, when you were initiated into the Egyptian mysteries, you'd lay down in the king's chambers and you'd be put in a death-like trance, where physically you didn't really die, but you were in a trance for 3 days, a sleep state for 3 days. And on the spiritual plane, you actually died and were reborn. And then you arose. And the words that they used were, come forth, awaken and come forth. And that was the same words that Jesus says to Lazarus. He says, awaken Lazarus and come forth. So it's showing that this was an initiation process that Jesus took Lazarus through, because he was tying together all the threads of initiation, all the threads of the mystery schools, and bringing them into one piece, one being, and sharing them with the masses. And that's why he's the great initiator of the human race. And that is part of the occult significance of his crucifixion, where now he was physically crucified and physically died for 3 days, and then actually rose and reincarnated or reappeared through his spiritual body. So now, what was once an event that happened through the mysteries, through initiation on the spiritual planes, was now enacted on the material plane. Guys, it was now enacted on the material plane. And so he actually initiated the entire human race, the earth itself. He initiated us. That's what this being did. And that's completely different than saying, oh, he died on the cross for your sins, and there's all this fucking guilt tripping and shit. It's bullshit. It's hiding the actual occult truth of what happened. It was that our entire species was initiated in that moment, and now anyone, you don't need to go to a mystery school anymore. Now anybody can access the initiatory experience, but we still need the inner teachings which were lost, which we don't get from the exoteric gospel, right? But that capability is now, that seed is planted within us, and it's there, and we can learn to access it. There are now no gatekeepers in that sense. Through that process where the spiritual initiation now became a material initiation, the Christ impulse was now intertwined with the soul, the group soul of the human species and the soul of the earth. And so what this did was, it not only did it save our connection to the Godhead, but it actually saved our connection to each other as well. Because even though there were teachings and teachers like the Buddha in the past who taught compassion, right, and love for all beings, if the Christ impulse did not incarnate, eventually we would never be able to feel compassion for each other. We would have been so separated. Again, that whole spirit of materialism, we would have crystallized so far into our individual intellectual egos, into the material realms, that we would have completely lost contact with the spiritual worlds and with each other. So the teachings of Buddha, that was compassion teachings, we wouldn't have been able to do that without the incarnation of Christ, because instead of going continually down, remember, boom, that was the hinge point, where now a seed of connection, of unity, was planted within our individuality. And that's the paradox, the mystery of the revelation of Christ. It's not like Eastern Enlightenment non-duality states, which is in abolishment of the individuality and emerging into oneness. The revelation of Christ is actually both. It's maintaining our individual ego consciousnesses whilst having a state of unity within that, which is profound, and that's why it's a paradox. Christianity, the whole thing is built upon a paradox. And so now, what we're moving into, what is attempting to happen through us, is that this seed is attempting to blossom more and more within us, so that we all become these Christified beings, where we have our individual selves, but we're in a complete state of unity. It's both. And the mind, the intellect can't grasp that, because the intellect, it has to be either or, one or the other, black or white. But we're moving beyond that, and that's actually symbolic of what evolutionarily, what we're being asked to do is move beyond the intellect consciousness, the head consciousness, into the heart consciousness. I'm not talking about the emotional heart. I'm not talking about the romantic heart. I'm talking about phenomenologically, your heart produces an electromagnetic field that's connected to the Earth's electromagnetic field, that's connected to the cosmos, boom, boom, boom. So there's that unity. It is the whole within the part. The heart is the part of us that contains the whole, and it's actually a center of perception, and it has its own mode of thinking. And that's why Jesus is associated with the heart and love, but not like emotional love, guys. We're talking about literal love as a mode of consciousness. And that's what Christ consciousness means. It means operating from the perception, allowing the heart to teach us a new way to think, so to speak. And that place is where those adversarial forces can't hijack us. The shadow lives in the intellect, inside the ego, which is in the intellect. The Luciferic and Ahrimanic forces that we've been talking about in this video. And so when we tune into the heart consciousness and heart awareness and cultivate that ability to actually think from that place and perceive the world through that place, we are actually Christifying ourselves. We're building the spiritual body. We're spiritualizing our bodies and spiritualizing our perception of the material world. And that's how we align ourselves with the actual Christ impulse, with the impulse, that this evolutionary impulse that is taking us back up. And this is the actual process of ascension. And through that process, when we develop a certain level of clairvoyance, we will actually have an internal experience of the Christ impulse, which is the light of all lights that is talked about by different Christian mystics and saints, and even in the Bible itself it's talked about. But the second coming isn't going to be a physical incarnation. That already happened. Christ already had its physical incarnation. Now, the Christ impulse is intertwined with our actual souls. So the second coming, it's an etheric Christ. We're going to experience Christ within our own soul on the etheric plane, but it's still something that is intertwined with, but outside of our own egos, right? Like we are in it. We are in it, right? And that's the idea. We're going to have an experience of the inner Christ. And that's the occult meaning of the second coming. Because there's going to come a time when Earth has run its course, when Earth has given us, the material Earth has given us all it can. And just like any star, there comes a time where it crumbles and the matter decomposes and decays, and it's done its mission. But what this whole thing is pointing us towards is how we can spiritualize our bodies and spiritualize the Earth to a point where we can live in a world as human beings where Earth and us will be completely spiritual, where it'll be completely spiritual, and we will just transition into that state and be able to move and progress through life consciously. So that, because right now, when you die, for example, unless you're initiated, you don't remember your physical life and it's erased. In the same way that you don't remember your dreams when you wake up. And so there's this unconsciousness to life. And through this spiritualization process, what we're doing is learning how to completely come into the spiritual worlds with our ego, with our individual consciousness, and move through this evolutionary experience of the divine consciously. And this is the mission of Christ, which is happening right now through each and every one of us. So I hope and trust that this was enlightening and inspiring to you. Please let me know your thoughts. If this is new for you, I invite you to share it with a friend, to spread this message, to spread the good news, so to speak, because if you're like me, you may have experienced a lot of trauma and dysfunction and abuse through Orthodox Christianity and regular church systems and all of that. There's just so much shame and guilt, and it just completely misses the point. And this stuff it's super healing information. It's very empowering information, and we need to get it out there. So that's my invitation to you, if that feels authentic for you. But if not, thank you for being here with me today. This has been really, really fun to share with you guys. And you can expect more videos like this in the future. I'm going to break down some more pieces in here in some other videos. And I will see you then. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Peace, peace, peace.